Alright guys, this is our biodiversity video notes. For some reason the first slide isn't coming up, so this is biodiversity. We want to talk about what it is, we want to talk about why it's important. Okay, so biodiversity, the definition is really basic. It's just a variety of different species. What number of species, how many different species do you have at a specific location? In one ecosystem, in one area, in one world, whatever area you're talking about. Species diversity is essentially biodiversity plus the abundance. So species diversity is not only how many species do you have, but also how many of each species. Do you have a healthy population of that species, or is there one or two representative organisms, but not really a viable amount to sustain the population? Okay, so genetic diversity is the variety in the genetic makeup. Same thing. So again, it's just these are all offshoots of the biodiversity category. Genetic makeup of organisms that allows them to reproduce and gain that competitive advantage that allows them to stay in that area. So you need to have a healthy genetic diversity. You've heard before people talk about the gene pool. We want the gene pool to be large. We want a good genetic makeup in order for organisms to pull a lot, because otherwise you have inbreeding happen, you have all kinds of that stuff happen, and then you end up having mutations happen and stuff gets unhealthy. Okay, so ecosystem diversity, what different types of ecosystems are there on a continent, in an area, in the world, whatever the case may be. Again, it depends on what area you define. Okay, so the importance of diversity. Why do we care what our biodiversity is? There's a lot of different reasons. Some of them people find more important than others. But the primary, these are the primary and the reasons that they're important. So stability, it's really important to have a stable environment. Without that, you lose the biodiversity, you lose the food chains. And so again, it comes back to, are you looking at this as an economic resource or as an environmental resource? So if you're looking at it from an environmental, you want it purely because you want it. Because it's pretty, because it's beautiful, because it's healthy, because it's natural. If you are looking at it from an economic standpoint, if you lose your biodiversity, then you lose your food web, which means that therefore you're losing the food that we are eating. Again, I just talked about the genetic diversity. We use, medicinal. We want a lot of biodiversity. The rainforest biodiversity is very high. We get a lot of our medicinal stuff from plants in the rainforests. Agricultural diversity is food for us. Industrial, the materials that we use to build things, to create things, we need those basic building blocks, those basic resources. So let me keep going. The scientific. Looking at new technology, new experiments, new learning happening. Just the aesthetic value is, it's a beautiful resource. It's nice looking. Ethical goes back to the environmental, and then the religious, based on what religion you are, based on how you feel about the environment. So if you look at these, the economic, the one that kind of comes back to money and to our resources that we want to use for sure would be the medicinal, would be the agricultural, would be the industrial, absolutely. You could make the argument for stability, you can make the argument for genetic diversity from an economic standpoint. I think that's it. For the technology basis, you could really use the scientific as an economic as well. And then from the environmental standpoint, for sure the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious are all pretty much environmentally based. You also want to look at the genetic reserves and the stability from an environmental standpoint as well. So you have really this combination of the economic standpoint and the environmental standpoint. Okay, so the impacts that we have on terrestrial, so on land, the biodiversity on land, we are using resources. The more increase we see in our population, the more resources we use. That leads to the activities that we use those resources for. So agriculture, industry, production, consumption, recreation, all of the stuff that we do uses those resources and has impacts on the biodiversity. So the direct effects of our activities is degradation and destruction, is flat out, you're cutting down forests, you're dredging, you're draining rivers, streams, whatever to use water. So that changes, as a result of that. So you really could put like an arrow over to here. As a result of the degradation and destruction, you see changes in the biodiversity. And then we're also, because we're doing this, it kind of has those effects. So these are the things that we're doing, and it's having these direct effects on the biodiversity. And then the more indirect effects that we see, kind of 1 or 2 steps removed, is that loss of biodiversity and the climate change. Okay, so this is just a quick chart to show you. It's highlighting the differences between the functional, the ecological, and here I'll move this so that you guys can see what that is. Species diversity and genetic diversity. So take a look at that, make sure you're comfortable with the different types of diversity that we need to be able to use. Okay, so biodiversity, it has really become more and more important in the past 30 years. Scientists are really realizing how much of an impact it has on stuff like the food web and climate and resources. And so biodiversity has become one of the 4 principles of sustainability. And it is so directly impact. Biodiversity is one of the first things that takes a hit because of our population growth, because of our economic development, because of our poverty. All of that is really putting a lot more pressure on ecosystems. Okay, so scientists have, we're going to kind of, for the rest of the PowerPoint, go through like some of the big topics in biodiversity. I mean, there are scientists that spend their whole career focusing on the biodiversity, even of a specific location. So we're going to kind of go through and talk about some of the highlights, the big concepts in biodiversity. So hotspots is one of the big ones. So make sure that you know what a hotspot is and why it's important. It's a center of biodiversity. So we see these areas around the world, and there's 34 of them, all in red. And they are the really important areas that have really high biodiversity, that have a lot of change, have a lot of evolution, have all this stuff going on. So the loss of that area, the loss of the biodiversity in those areas would have a much bigger impact than, say, if we messed with the middle of a desert somewhere. Okay, so extinction is another concept that we need to be, unfortunately, comfortable with. When a species, when an organism's climate, habitat changes, when its habitat or its food or its whatever, when it can't eat, it can't survive where it is, it's got 2 options. It can either adapt to the new reality, or it will die off. So if it can't leave, it's gonna die. When it can't adapt to the changing conditions. So for example, the golden toad, Costa Rica, is now extinct because of climate change. The Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica has become colder and colder, and the toad can't survive. Okay, so again, why should we care? And this goes back to, if you're looking at it, this goes back to the economic, and then the economic and the environmental. Can't spell today. Economic and environmental values. Okay. Looking at extinctions. Extinctions are nothing new, and it's nothing that is necessarily a bad thing. Extinctions have been happening since the Earth started. Almost all, you can see 99.9% of all of the species that have ever been on the Earth are now extinct. We have found evidence. There are 6 mass extinctions that have happened in the fossil record, so it's happened more and more. The problem becomes right here. So the problem becomes that before the 20th century, before humans had started to have a big impact on their surroundings, the extinction rate was really small, right? There are these events that had a mass extinction, but then generally the stuff was happening pretty slow. Now you can see how much it's moved up by a factor of 100 to 1,000%, which is pretty huge, right? And so they attribute that to human interference, to climate change from human activities, to loss of habitat from human activities, to all the stuff that goes back to that chart that I showed you earlier. Okay, so you can see over time, just same thing that I just showed you. It's just a graph of the same thing. So you see the extinctions going up, and the number of species over time. Okay, so this shows you those big mass extinctions. So starting long time ago, you had the first mass extinction sometime in the Cambrian period, and that was about half of the animals in the world, most of the trilobites. These are a lot of invertebrates at this point. And then you come up to an extinction, the Devonian extinction, and you lost about 30%. The Permian extinction was huge. A lot of marine stuff, a lot of trees. Triassic extinction, Cretaceous extinction, and then the current crisis they're attributing to human activity. So you could actually go through and do some research, if you're bored, don't want to do anything else, to show why, they have theories. Obviously we don't know, but they have theories about why each of these extinctions happened. So like the Cretaceous one might be the meteor, stuff like that. So there's a lot of theories out there, but they do have the evidence that, somewhere in this general, about 65 million years ago, there's this huge extinction that happened pretty suddenly, and we don't know, or we don't necessarily know why, but we have some ideas. Okay, so you can look at extinction in a couple different levels. You can look at a local extinction, where they're no longer found in a specific area. So that's very common, right? And that's where you look at the habitat range of the mountain lion has drastically decreased, right? So they're extinct in a lot of local areas, but they're not extinct overall. You can look at an ecological extinction where there's so few members of the species that even though they're not really extinct, they're really not functioning as, and they don't have any impact on the food web, they don't have any impact on the area, on the resources, on the whatever. So you can really kind of discount them because they're not either helping or hurting anything. It's just a few, 2 or 3 members left, whatever, very small number of individuals left. And then the global extinction is what most people think of when they think of extinction. That's just gone, period. Endangered is very similar to that or ecological extinction. Endangered would probably have more species in the ecological, but it's on its way to that. So few survivors that they're in danger of becoming extinct. For example, the leopard. Threatened or vulnerable is one step above that. So still abundant, but we're seeing a decline in numbers. The northern sea lion, and actually the species that my husband works on, the Steller sea lion, is actually threatened right now. The numbers in the U.S. are declining. The numbers in Russia are healthy. So part of his dissertation for his PhD is trying to figure out why the sea lions here in the U.S. are declining and why the ones in Russia are doing well. Okay, rare is a decline in species. So you see, so you see if we were to go through all those previous slides, you were to go, rare, you'd be normal up here, and then you'd be rare, and then you'd be threatened, and then you'd be endangered, and then you'd have the ecological extinction, and then you'd have the global extinction. So this would be the process, unless something is done, obviously, to reverse that. So what can we do? There are these priorities that we have, and I don't know why it says 8, because there's 5 of them. But these are the 5 priorities that we have to protect biodiversity. This is what scientists are trying to concentrate on, is looking at those hot spots. Those are big. we want the old growth, the really old, really healthy, really stable ecosystems to stay intact, not to mess with them. So we may cut down trees, we may cut down forests, but we're going to pick and choose which ones we cut down much more carefully. Scientists are frantically working on mapping the biodiversity, taking inventories of species, so that we can make a better decision on how to protect them. We don't know how to protect it if we don't know what's out there, if we don't know where it is, how much it is, so on and so forth. That holds especially true for the ocean. So the marine hotspots, we don't know. We don't know where they are. Notice that all the hotspots we identified already are terrestrial. So trying to figure out where the marine hotspots are is a big key concept right now in marine science. And then almost all lake and river freshwater ecosystems right now are threatened. They're one of the, as a group, if you look at terrestrial, freshwater, marine, so on and so forth, freshwater is one of the most hard-hit ecosystems overall, because that's where all the people are. If you think about it, everybody wants to be on the water. And so we need to concentrate and focus on restoring them, protecting them, and regulating that better. Okay, so these are the things that causes extinction. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory. This is a concept that looks at K selected species versus R selected. So this is hang on, sorry, let me go back. This is a K selected species. And that's just kind of grouping together critters with these types of characteristics, because they tend to be more likely to become endangered, become extinct. So low reproductive rate. I mean, you can read through all this. I don't want this video to take 10 years. But these are the impacts that we see high. So like an elephant that would fit this, an organism that would fit this is an elephant. So your example here for K-selected species that fits these criteria is an elephant. So make sure, please, that you are familiar with these. A K-selected species has what types of characteristics. Okay, and then looking at some of the globally extinct species, these have all become extinct because of human activities. Most of them was hunting. Both the dodo and the great auk were flightless birds, and so you could just really walk up and spear them, and they were very easy to catch, and so were hunted pretty fast with early explorers, stuff like that. Okay, hippo is your next concept right here. Habitat destruction, invasive species, population growth, pollution, and overharvest. These are the reasons that most extinctions happen if they are caused by humans. So like I said, it goes back to that economic versus environmental thing. These are the things that we do that causes extinctions. Okay, so looking at species, how do you figure out whether a species is threatened? We use a number of different methods when we are trying to quantify this. We look at the evenness, the relative distribution of the species. Are they all clumped in one area, or are they spread out? We look at the species diversity, which again, remember, is not only the number of species, but the abundance, and the density, the richness or the density. And again, total number of species in an area. So there's a lot of different formulas you can use to kind of show in different ways what the health of that area, that ecosystem is. So they have published a list. The red list happens, I think, every year. And so you see how quickly it's going up, increasing from every few years. And so the red list is something you can go online and look at. But it's the threatened species overall, and what level. Are they threatened? Are they endangered? Are they ecologically extinct? So on and so forth. Okay, continuing, endangered versus threatened. We've talked about this already. I talked about freshwater is so hard hit right now. It's scary how unhealthy most of our freshwater ecosystems are. Okay, so you have when you're working on trying to fix this, when you're working on biodiversity as a scientist and trying to increase biodiversity, you have a couple different ways you can do it. You can use an ecosystem approach, or you can use a species approach. So I'll let you read through that, pause this, and make sure you understand. Pretty self-explanatory. It's either kind of looking at the big picture in the ecosystem approach, and if I protect the ecosystem, then all of the animals in that ecosystem will be good, or the species approach. So the key to choosing which I'm going to look at is what the situation is. If I have something like a rainforest where I have a whole bunch of endangered or threatened organisms, I will take the ecosystem approach, and I will protect the rainforest, and therefore everything in it should be okay. But if I'm looking somewhere, let's say the African grasslands, and I want to specifically focus, the grasslands overall are doing pretty good, but everybody's hunting elephants, then I'm going to go for the species approach and work to protect the elephants specifically just on that species, because the hunters aren't hunting the rodents or the birds or the whatever on the grasslands, they're hunting the elephants. And so it kind of depends on your situation. The cities treaty, I'm sorry, this should have an extra I. Cities treaty is an international treaty to protect endangered and threatened plants and animals. It regulates wildlife trade. It prohibits, you are not allowed to trade in endangered species. So if you want to get some exotic pet, you have to make sure that it's okay to have, it's illegal to have, so like monkeys are not legal to have as pets, so on and so forth. And then it makes allowances, limited allowances for threatened species, mostly in education or conservation habitats or locations. So, there are some facilities, but they're not really going to let Joe Schmo off the street have a threatened species. Okay. The Endangered Species Act, you guys have already talked about. It's in your summary of all the laws. This is very controversial. It's had one of the most far-reaching effects. They started this in 1973. It forbids federal agencies to carry out or fund projects that would jeopardize endangered species. So, for example, actually a very relevant example, my husband, I said, was working on the Steller sea lions. He is actually not allowed to work on Steller sea lions in the U.S. because the Endangered Species Act protects Steller sea lions because they are threatened. So even though he's a scientist and trying to help them, if you guys remember, his project was to put the camera mounts and the stuff on the sea lions, which carried a risk with it. And so he's not allowed to do that in the U.S. because it's dangerous with a threatened and endangered animal. So that's why he had to go to Russia to look at sea lions, even though there are sea lions here the Steller sea lions here in the U.S. It also makes it illegal for Americans to engage in commerce that is in any way associated with endangered or threatened animals. You can't kill them, you can't hunt them, you can't collect them, you can't have them for pets. In some states, you can't even walk up to them if there's a seal or a whale stranded on a beach. You're not supposed to touch it. So it was, like I said, enacted in 1973 and had significant and profound impacts on the population. Okay, there have been a few success stories. The elephant, is improving. It's still poachers are dangerous and kind of has its ups and downs, but it's better. And then North American wolves have made a huge comeback. You guys saw the video on Monday about the wolves in Yellowstone River. And then the bald eagle has also made a huge comeback and is very common today. Okay, reconciliation ecology goes back to the ecosystem approach. So that chart that I showed you, the ecosystem side. And so they want to, humans change the environment. We change the shape of the land, we build stuff, we do stuff. And so all of that free space that animals lived in is gone. So really reconciliation ecology is providing them space on rooftops, around places for higher biodiversity in areas that we live in. So that's for the squirrels and the birds and the insects and all that stuff. So rather than having a totally animal-less environment other than us, we want to be living with them. Okay, so life zones, aquatic and terrestrial. Makes sense, right? Land versus water. Okay, so in general, this is a total generality, which I don't really even like, but a lot of the textbooks use it, so I want to make sure that you're familiar with it in case they ask you about it on the test. In general, species numbers drop as we move from the equator toward the poles. However, so that's what you're supposed to know for the test. And it's a generality. It's, stuff in the rainforests and the tropics in the water and the marine zones tend to have very high biodiversity. But that's not to say, therefore, that there's a very low biodiversity at the North Pole or the South Pole or whatever. There is certainly lower, but there are hot spots even in colder climates. There are areas that have perhaps not as high of a biodiversity, but definitely a higher species diversity where you have a very abundance of critters. And we'll look at some critter notes and talk about that. So you see the difference between the rainforest food web that I showed you and the Arctic food web. So yes, there is a lower biodiversity, but you still see, I think the point that I want to make is that you still see in the Arctic more animals than you would anticipate, I think. Okay, so in the aquatic refers to any water. Most commonly, and in science, you will hear aquatic referred to as fresh water and marine referred to as salt water. So if you were to ask a scientist, this is aquatic and this is marine. Okay? Again, comparing aquatic food webs, looking at the differences there and working through that. This is looking at those hot spots, so it's 34 hot spots plus human, overlaid with human population density. So you see really clearly that it actually doesn't tend to be hot spots where there are a lot of people, although some of them are very close to a lot of people. So you see hot spots up in here, and that go from there. Sorry, my mouse is freaking out. Okay. Maybe we'll move on? Okay. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. So, island biogeography explains how islands came to be as populated as how they do. And it generally takes the concept, we're going to talk about it. Actually, I'm going to wait, because we're going to talk about we're going to do a lab about it. So, there is a process for islands to become populated with plants and animals, and we will show you how, and I will show you how that works. We'll do that lab. Habitat fragmentation, there are a couple people that did this for their projects, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, but that shows those habitat islands. And then urbanization again, so it doesn't necessarily to be, that habitat island can happen where there's no human population around or where there is a significant human population around. Okay, so this is looking at food webs in the marine ecosystem. So you see a lot higher biodiversity in coastal zones. That's the greatest biodiversity. Versus the open sea has much less, and it's spread out a whole lot more. So a lot of people call the open ocean like a desert ecosystem because there are significant biomass. There's tons and tons of individual, but they tend to be a school right here and then not anything else for 10 or 15 miles. Coral reefs, rainforests, of the ocean, very high biodiversity, nothing you don't know there, nothing that's not new. So then looking at populations, if we were to look at graphs of this, you would see a population, a J-curve. The population is increasing dramatically. Looks like a J, right? Or an S-curve, they are looking like an S. They're moving like this. And this S-curve is generally around a carrying capacity. So you're seeing it fluctuate back and forth. So you see it fluctuate around. It gets above the carrying capacity. The animals don't do as well. So they die off, and then it gets below the carrying capacity, plenty of resources, and it comes back up. And so this shouldn't be anything new to you guys. The K-selected animals I've talked about already. That'd be something like an elephant. An R-selected animal would be something like a cockroach. Okay, invasive species. Let me pause. Okay, We only have a few more slides. We're going to do this. Okay, so invasive species have been introduced intentionally. These are a huge problem. Sometimes, they can be introduced intentionally or unintentionally. So intentionally, I don't know what people are thinking. They, put this bird in here to kill all the bees, and then bad stuff happens. So we'll talk a lot about this. If they're unintentional, they came over, a lot of the marine stuff came over on ballast water in ships. Zebra mussels, for example, came over in ballast water into the Great Lakes, and now they've just cleaned out the Great Lakes in North America. It's become very dangerous. Totally messes with the ecosystem, because it tends to be like the R-selected species that come over that are invasive species that can handle really well. They reproduce fast, they don't require a lot of resources, they're really strong, so on and so forth, and then they end up killing the K-selected species. Would you make everybody wait outside for me for a minute? So this is a couple of examples. Argentina fire ant, I'll let you read this. I'm going to let you read this too, because this video is super long already. This is what you can do for invasive species. Okay, so again, this is that K-selected versus R-selected. So successful invader is going to be an R-selected critter. And then the K-selected stuff is where you would find, this type of ecosystem is where it's going to be good for the invader species to come in, because they have a lot of K-selected species in them already. So the R-selected species, high reproductive rate, long-lived, easy to disperse, they're generalists, they can tolerate a lot, they're not very specific, whereas that elephant stuff was a K-selected. Okay, same concept here. So the K versus R, make sure that you guys are really comfortable with that. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, we talked about the Endangered Species Act. Read through that. This is more information about the Endangered Species